In the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges and hollows echo with whispers of the past, lies a chapter of American history so dark that even today, residents of certain communities refuse to speak its name aloud. Between 1692 and 1736, while Salem's witch trials captured the attention of colonial America, a far more brutal and systematic persecution was unfolding in the remote valleys of what would become West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. These weren't isolated incidents of mass hysteria. They were calculated campaigns of terror that would claim the lives of over 300 suspected witches and leave entire bloodlines extinguished from the historical record. What makes the Appalachian witch trials particularly chilling isn't just their scale or brutality, but the deliberate effort to erase them from history. Unlike Salem, where meticulous court records documented every accusation and confession, the Appalachian trials were conducted in secret by self-appointed tribunals who burned their evidence and buried their victims in unmarked graves. The few surviving accounts come from personal journals hidden in root cellars, letters smuggled out by terrified witnesses, and the testimonies of those who escaped the mountains with nothing but their lives and memories too horrific to forget. By the time you finish watching this investigation, you'll understand why these trials remained hidden for centuries, why certain families still won't return to their ancestral lands, and why modern historians have only recently begun to piece together the full scope of what happened in those isolated mountain communities. I've spent the last 2 years tracking down descendants of survivors, analyzing recently discovered documents, and visiting locations where the trials took place, many of which still show physical evidence of the horrors that unfolded there. But before we dive into the specific cases that will haunt your dreams, you need to understand how these trials began, because unlike Salem's sudden outbreak of accusations, the Appalachian persecution was methodical, organized, and driven by motivations that went far beyond religious extremism. The men who orchestrated these trials weren't acting out of spiritual fervor. They were eliminating threats to their power, silencing those who possessed knowledge they couldn't control, and systematically destroying communities that refused to conform to their vision of mountain society. The roots of the Appalachian witch trials stretch back to 1689, when a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Mordecai arrived in the valley that would later become known as Perdition Hollow. Mordecai wasn't your typical frontier minister. He was a former member of Cotton Mather's inner circle who had fled Massachusetts after being accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on suspected witches. He brought with him not just religious fervor, but a detailed manual he called the Mountain Codex, which outlined methods for identifying, testing, and purging supernatural threats from isolated communities. What made Mordecai particularly dangerous wasn't his theological knowledge, but his understanding of mountain culture. He recognized that Appalachian settlers were deeply suspicious of outsiders, fiercely protective of their families, and willing to take justice into their own hands when formal law enforcement was days away. He also understood that these communities relied heavily on folk medicine, herbalism, and traditions that could easily be reinterpreted as witchcraft by someone with the right knowledge and influence. Mordecai's first target was a woman named Constance Whitmore, a midwife and healer who had earned the respect of 3 different settlements by successfully treating everything from difficult births to mysterious illnesses that baffled other practitioners. Her crime wasn't maleficium, harmful magic, but rather her refusal to acknowledge Mordecai's authority over medical practices in the region. When she publicly challenged his claim that certain healing herbs were tools of the devil, she sealed her fate. The trial of Constance Whitmore established the template that would be used for hundreds of subsequent cases. Rather than following established legal procedures, Mordecai convened what he called a tribunal of purification, consisting of himself and 12 male heads of households who had sworn loyalty to his interpretation of mountain justice. The proceedings took place not in a courthouse or church, but in a clearing surrounded by 13 oak trees, where the accused was forced to undergo tests that made Salem's trials look merciful by comparison. Constance was subjected to what Mordecai called the weighing of truth, a series of ordeals designed to reveal supernatural corruption. She was forced to carry red-hot iron bars while reciting scripture, submerged in ice-cold streams while bound with ropes and compelled to drink concoctions that caused violent physical reactions. When she survived these tests, which Mordecai claimed proved her guilt, since only supernatural power could have protected her, she was sentenced to what he termed purification by fire. But here's where the Appalachian trials diverged from their more famous counterparts. The execution wasn't public. Instead, Constance was taken to a cave system that Mordecai had consecrated as a cleansing chamber, where she was burned alive in complete darkness, while the tribunal chanted prayers meant to prevent her spirit from escaping. Her ashes were scattered in running water, and her name was struck from all family records. As far as the official history was concerned, Constance Whitmore had never existed. The success of Constance's trial emboldened Mordecai to expand his operations. Within 6 months, he had established similar tribunals in 7 different valleys, each led by local men who had been trained in his methods and given copies of the Mountain Codex. These weren't random vigilante groups. They were organized cells operating under a unified system of identification, trial, and elimination that would make the Spanish Inquisition envious. The criteria for accusation were deliberately broad and subjective. A woman who knew too much about herbal remedies could be labeled a poisoner. A man who predicted weather patterns too accurately was obviously consulting supernatural forces. Children who displayed unusual intelligence or intuition were suspected of trafficking with familiar spirits. Even physical characteristics became evidence. Red hair, unusual eye colors, birthmarks, or scars could all be interpreted as marks of demonic allegiance. What made these accusations particularly insidious was how they targeted the most valuable members of mountain communities: midwives, healers, weather-wise farmers, and anyone who possessed specialized knowledge that couldn't be easily replaced found themselves under suspicion. The trials weren't just religious persecution. They were a systematic dismantling of the traditional knowledge systems that had allowed isolated communities to survive in harsh mountain environments. The case of the Brennan family illustrates how quickly accusations could spread through entire bloodlines. Thomas Brennan was a blacksmith whose metalworking skills were legendary throughout the region. He could forge tools that lasted decades, repair damaged weapons that other smiths declared hopeless, and create intricate ironwork that seemed to defy the limitations of primitive mountain forges. His wife, Mary, was known for her ability to predict which livestock would survive harsh winters and which crops would flourish in difficult seasons. When a rival blacksmith named Samuel Cray failed to secure a lucrative contract with a neighboring settlement, he approached Mordecai's tribunal with accusations that Thomas's superior skills could only be explained by supernatural assistance. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling according to the Mountain Codex. Thomas worked mostly at night. His forge burned with unusual colors, and he sometimes hummed melodies that no one recognized while working. Mary's agricultural knowledge became equally suspect when Cray pointed out that she often walked her fields at dawn, examining plants and soil with an intensity that suggested she was conducting some form of divination. The fact that her predictions proved accurate was presented as proof of guilt rather than skill. After all, how could a mortal woman know things that only supernatural forces could reveal? The Brennan children, 3 boys and 2 girls ranging in age from 6 to 16, were accused of serving as their parents' familiar spirits, carrying messages between the family and whatever dark forces they served. The evidence was heartbreaking in its simplicity. The children were unusually well behaved, helped with farm work without complaint, and demonstrated the same uncanny ability to predict weather and animal behavior that had made their mother suspect. The trial of the Brennan family lasted 3 days and established several precedents that would shape future proceedings. First, entire bloodlines could be considered contaminated by supernatural influence, making it necessary to eliminate not just the primary suspects, but their offspring as well. Second, useful skills and knowledge were reinterpreted as evidence of demonic bargains, meaning that the most competent and valuable community members were automatically suspect. Third, the definition of familiar spirits was expanded to include not just animals, but human family members who might be serving as supernatural intermediaries. The Brennans were subjected to trials that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Thomas was forced to work his forge while bound with chains, challenged to produce perfect metalwork under conditions that would have defeated any normal smith. When he succeeded, driven by desperation and the knowledge that his family's lives depended on his performance, his skill was presented as final proof of supernatural assistance. Mary was tested by being forced to predict the exact number of eggs each hen would lay over the course of a week, the precise day that specific plants would bloom, and the outcome of card games played by tribunal members. Her knowledge of natural cycles and animal behavior allowed her to make educated guesses that proved remarkably accurate, sealing her fate in the eyes of judges who refused to believe that observation and experience could account for such precision. The children faced the most creative torments. They were separated from their parents and questioned about conversations they claimed to have had with animals, asked to demonstrate any unusual abilities they might possess, and forced to explain their knowledge of farm work and household tasks that seemed advanced for their ages. Their honest answers, describing how they learned by watching their parents, listening to adult conversations, and paying attention to seasonal patterns, were twisted into confessions of supernatural instruction. When the tribunal pronounced all 5 family members guilty of witchcraft, their execution was designed to send a message that would resonate throughout the mountain communities. Rather than quick deaths, the Brennans were subjected to what Mordecai called the Great Purification, a ritual that took place over the course of 3 nights in the consecrated cave system, where each family member was burned separately while the others were forced to watch. The psychological impact of the Brennan trial extended far beyond their immediate community. Word spread through the mountains that no one was safe from accusation, that competence and knowledge were more dangerous than ignorance, and that family ties offered no protection against the tribunal's judgment. The message was clear: conform to Mordecai's vision of acceptable mountain life, or face systematic elimination. But the Brennan case also marked the beginning of organized resistance to the trials. Thomas had been widely respected as a craftsman and community leader, and his destruction galvanized opposition among those who recognized that the tribunals posed an existential threat to mountain society itself. Secret meetings began taking place in remote locations where trusted individuals shared information about tribunal activities and began planning ways to protect their communities from Mordecai's expanding network of persecution. The resistance movement that emerged from the ashes of the Brennan family would eventually grow into an underground network spanning multiple states. But their early efforts were hampered by the same isolation that made the trials possible in the first place. Communication between distant settlements was slow and unreliable, making it difficult to coordinate defensive measures or warn communities about approaching tribunal members. Meanwhile, Mordecai's influence continued to expand as he refined his methods and recruited new followers. The Mountain Codex was updated regularly with new identification techniques, trial procedures, and purification rituals based on lessons learned from previous cases. What had started as religious extremism was evolving into something far more systematic and dangerous. A campaign of cultural genocide designed to reshape Appalachian society according to one man's twisted vision of spiritual purity. The trials that followed the Brennan case would test the limits of human cruelty and reveal the true scope of Mordecai's ambitions. But they would also demonstrate the resilience of mountain communities and the courage of individuals who refused to be terrorized into submission. As we'll see in the next part of this investigation, the persecution that began with Constance Whitmore's death would eventually consume entire settlements and leave scars on the Appalachian landscape that remain visible to this day. The resistance movement that emerged from the ashes of the Brennan family would eventually grow into an underground network spanning multiple states, but their early efforts were hampered by the same isolation that made the trials possible in the first place. Communication between distant settlements was slow and unreliable, making it difficult to coordinate defensive measures or warn communities about approaching tribunal members. Meanwhile, Mordecai's influence continued to expand as he refined his methods and recruited new followers. The Mountain Codex was updated regularly with new identification techniques, trial procedures, and purification rituals based on lessons learned from previous cases. What had started as religious extremism was evolving into something far more systematic and dangerous, a campaign of cultural genocide designed to reshape Appalachian society according to one man's twisted vision of spiritual purity. The trials that followed the Brennan case would test the limits of human cruelty and reveal the true scope of Mordecai's ambitions. but they would also demonstrate the resilience of mountain communities and the courage of individuals who refused to be terrorized into submission. As we'll see in the next part of this investigation, the persecution that began with Constance Whitmore's death would eventually consume entire settlements and leave scars on the Appalachian landscape that remain visible to this day. By 1693, Mordecai had established what he called the Circle of Purification, a network of interconnected tribunals that operated across a territory spanning nearly 200 square miles of mountain wilderness. Each tribunal was led by a trusted lieutenant who had been personally trained in the application of the Mountain Codex, creating a decentralized system that could continue operating even if individual cells were discovered or destroyed. The most notorious of these lieutenants was a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, who controlled the tribunals in what is now southeastern Kentucky. Blackwood wasn't just a religious fanatic, he was a calculating strategist who understood that the trials could be used to eliminate personal enemies, acquire valuable property, and consolidate political power within mountain communities. Under his leadership, the accusations took on a decidedly economic dimension that revealed the true motivations behind much of the persecution. Blackwood's first major target was the Hartwell Trading Post, a prosperous establishment that served as the commercial hub for 5 different settlements. The Hartwell family had built their success on fair dealing, accurate weights and measures, and an uncanny ability to predict which goods would be in demand during different seasons. Their warehouse was always stocked with exactly what mountain families needed, whether it was seed grain before planting season or medical supplies before harsh winters. In the paranoid atmosphere created by the trials, this commercial success became deeply suspicious. How could the Hartwells know exactly what their customers would need weeks or months in advance? How could they maintain such accurate inventory records when most mountain families couldn't even read? Why did travelers from distant settlements always seem to find their way to the Hartwell post, even when they claimed to be lost? The accusations against the Hartwell family were presented to Blackwood's tribunal by a consortium of competing merchants who had been systematically outmaneuvered by the family's superior business practices. The evidence they presented was a masterpiece of twisted logic that transformed every aspect of successful commerce into proof of supernatural conspiracy. The Hartwells' detailed record keeping was presented as evidence of unnatural communication with demonic forces who provided advanced knowledge of market conditions. Their ability to predict seasonal demand was characterized as divination rather than experience. Their fair treatment of customers was reinterpreted as a supernatural compulsion that prevented them from charging fair prices. After all, what honest merchant would consistently undersell his competitors without supernatural motivation? Even the physical layout of the trading post was presented as evidence of occult practices. The building was constructed in a hexagonal shape that supposedly concentrated supernatural energies, with storage areas arranged according to principles that the accusers claimed were derived from ancient grimoires rather than practical considerations. The fact that the hexagonal design actually provided more efficient storage and better traffic flow was dismissed as irrelevant. The shape itself was proof of demonic influence. The trial of the Hartwell family introduced several innovations that would become standard practice in subsequent proceedings. First, property seizure was formalized as an essential component of purification, since goods acquired through supernatural means were considered tainted and had to be redistributed among the faithful. Second, the concept of collective guilt was expanded to include not just family members, but business associates, regular customers, and anyone who had benefited from the accused's allegedly supernatural activities. This expansion of culpability meant that the Hartwell trial ultimately involved over 40 individuals from 6 different settlements. Customers who had received good service were accused of knowingly participating in occult commerce. Suppliers who had provided goods to the trading post were suspected of being part of a supernatural network. Even casual visitors who had stopped for directions were questioned about their interactions with the family. The interrogation techniques used during the expanded Hartwell proceedings pushed the boundaries of physical and psychological endurance. Suspects were subjected to what Blackwood called the revelation of truth, a systematic process of sleep deprivation, starvation, and physical discomfort designed to break down their resistance to questioning. Those who maintained their innocence were accused of being protected by supernatural forces, while those who confessed were obviously guilty of the charges against them. The actual trial took place in an abandoned mine shaft that Blackwood had converted into what he termed a chamber of judgment. The space was deliberately designed to maximize psychological pressure on the accused. The ceiling was so low that adults had to crouch, creating constant physical discomfort. The walls were lined with mirrors salvaged from various households, creating disorienting reflections that made it difficult to focus on any single point. The only light came from candles arranged in patterns that Blackwood claimed would reveal supernatural auras around guilty individuals. The Hartwell family patriarch, Samuel, was subjected to what became known as the Test of Commerce, a series of challenges designed to prove that his business success was supernatural in origin. He was given a collection of random goods and challenged to predict their market value without supernatural assistance. When his years of experience allowed him to make accurate assessments, this was presented as proof of demonic consultation. When he occasionally guessed incorrectly, this was interpreted as evidence that his supernatural protectors were withdrawing their support. His wife, Rebecca, faced accusations related to her legendary hospitality and cooking skills. The tribunal demanded that she prepare meals without using any of her usual ingredients, seasonings, or techniques. When the food turned out poorly, this was presented as proof that her normal cooking abilities were supernatural in nature. When she managed to create edible meals despite the restrictions, this was interpreted as evidence that she was receiving ongoing demonic assistance. The Hartwell children were subjected to tests that targeted their literacy and mathematical abilities, skills that were rare in mountain communities and therefore automatically suspect. They were forced to solve complex calculations without using any written materials, challenged to read passages from unfamiliar books, and required to explain how they had acquired knowledge that seemed advanced for their ages and circumstances. The most disturbing aspect of the Hartwell trial was how it demonstrated the complete breakdown of community bonds under the pressure of the persecution. Neighbors who had traded with the family for years suddenly recalled suspicious incidents that had seemed innocent at the time. Friends who had shared meals at the Hartwell table now remembered unusual flavors that might have been supernatural in origin. Even children who had played with the Hartwell youngsters came forward with stories of games that seemed to involve unnatural knowledge or abilities. The psychological manipulation involved in generating these testimonies was sophisticated and deliberate. Blackwood and his associates spent weeks interviewing potential witnesses, using leading questions and suggested memories to create a narrative of supernatural corruption that stretched back years. They understood that memory is malleable, especially under stress, and they exploited this vulnerability to construct a web of accusations that seemed to corroborate each other. The execution of the Hartwell family and their associates was designed to serve as both punishment and warning. Rather than quick deaths, they were subjected to what Blackwood called the Great Accounting, a process where each individual was forced to confess to specific supernatural crimes before being killed. Those who refused to confess were tortured until they provided the required admissions, while those who confessed immediately were accused of withholding additional information. The economic impact of the Hartwell trial extended far beyond the immediate victims. The seizure of their property and inventory created a temporary windfall for Blackwood's supporters, but it also disrupted the commercial networks that had sustained mountain communities for decades. Without the Hartwell trading post, settlements were forced to rely on less efficient and more expensive alternatives, creating hardships that rippled through the region for years. More importantly, the trial established a precedent that anyone's success could be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. Farmers who produced abundant crops, craftsmen who created superior goods, and merchants who provided fair value all became potential targets for accusation. The message was clear. Mediocrity was safety, while excellence was dangerous. The success of the Hartwell trial emboldened Blackwood to expand his operations beyond individual families to entire communities that refused to acknowledge tribunal authority. His next target was the settlement of Haven's Rest, an isolated community of about 60 families who had maintained their independence by developing sophisticated systems of mutual aid and collective decision-making. Haven's Rest was problematic for the tribunals because it demonstrated that mountain communities could thrive without submitting to external authority. The settlement had no formal leaders, no established church, and no rigid social hierarchies. Instead, decisions were made through consensus, resources were shared according to need, and conflicts were resolved through mediation rather than punishment. This egalitarian approach to community organization was fundamentally incompatible with Mordecai's vision of mountain society, which required clear hierarchies, unquestioned authority, and absolute submission to tribunal judgment. Haven's Rest represented an alternative model of mountain life that could inspire other communities to resist the persecution, making it a strategic target for elimination. The accusations against Haven's Rest were broader and more systematic than previous cases. Rather than targeting specific individuals, Blackwood accused the entire community of practicing what he called collective sorcery, a form of supernatural organization that allowed ordinary people to achieve results that should have been impossible without demonic assistance. The evidence presented to support these accusations was both creative and disturbing. The community's success in agriculture was attributed to their alleged ability to communicate with earth spirits who provided information about optimal planting times and soil conditions. Their sophisticated systems of food preservation and storage were characterized as supernatural techniques that prevented natural decay. Even their consensus-based decision-making process was presented as evidence of mind control or supernatural influence that prevented normal human disagreement. The trial of Haven's Rest would prove to be the largest and most complex proceeding in the history of the Appalachian witch trials. It involved over 200 individuals when extended families, trading partners, and occasional visitors were included in the accusations. The proceedings would last for nearly 2 months and establish precedents that would shape the persecution for years to come. But the Haven's Rest trial would also mark the beginning of organized armed resistance to the tribunals. The community's isolation had allowed them to develop defensive capabilities that other settlements lacked, and their commitment to collective action made them formidable opponents when they finally decided to fight back. The confrontation between Blackwood's tribunal and the defenders of Haven's Rest would become the defining moment of the Appalachian witch trials, a violent clash that would determine whether the persecution would continue to expand or whether the mountain communities would finally find the courage to stand together against their tormentors. As we'll see in the next part of this investigation, the siege of Haven's Rest would reveal the true nature of the forces behind the trials and set in motion events that would ultimately determine the fate of thousands of mountain families. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome would echo through Appalachian history for generations to come. The siege of Haven's Rest began on a fog-shrouded morning in October 1693, when Blackwood arrived at the settlement's perimeter with a force of nearly 80 tribunal members drawn from across his network of mountain cells. Unlike previous trials, which had relied on surprise and psychological manipulation, this confrontation would be decided by violence, a fact that both sides understood from the moment the armed men emerged from the tree line. The defenders of Haven's Rest had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Warning systems had been established using mirror signals and smoke patterns that could communicate across vast distances without revealing specific locations. Food and water had been stockpiled in hidden caches throughout the settlement. Most importantly, the community had made a collective decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. They would resist the tribunals with lethal force if necessary. The psychological transformation required for this decision cannot be overstated. These were people who had built their entire community around principles of cooperation, mediation, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. They had no military training, limited weapons, and no experience with organized violence. But they had something that Blackwood's forces lacked: intimate knowledge of their territory and absolute commitment to protecting their families. The initial confrontation took place at dawn near the settlement's main entrance, where Blackwood had positioned his men to deliver what he expected would be a standard demand for surrender. The tribunal leader had brought with him a formal proclamation charging the entire community with collective sorcery, along with detailed instructions for the trial proceedings that would follow their inevitable capitulation. Instead of submission, Blackwood was met by a delegation of 12 Haven's Rest residents who had been selected to speak for the community. Their spokesperson was a woman named Elizabeth Corwin, a former midwife who had fled to Haven's Rest after escaping from a tribunal in Virginia. Her presence sent a clear message. This community included individuals who had already experienced the tribunal's idea of justice and refused to submit to it again. The conversation that followed was recorded in a journal kept by one of Blackwood's lieutenants, a man named Marcus Thorne, who would later defect to the resistance movement. According to Thorne's account, Corwin's response to the formal accusations was both eloquent and defiant. She pointed out that the charges against Haven's Rest were so broad that they essentially criminalized successful community organization, cooperative agriculture, and collective decision-making, activities that were fundamental to mountain survival. More importantly, Corwin challenged the legal and moral authority of the tribunals themselves. She demanded to know under what law Blackwood claimed the right to try entire communities for crimes that had no basis in scripture, common law, or colonial statute. She questioned how men who operated in secret, kept no official records, and answered to no higher authority could claim to represent divine justice. Blackwood's response revealed both his arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he was facing. He declared that the tribunals derived their authority directly from God, that their mandate to purge supernatural corruption superseded all human law, and that resistance to their judgment was itself evidence of demonic influence. He gave the community 1 hour to surrender unconditionally or face the consequences of their defiance. The hour that followed was filled with frantic activity as both sides prepared for what everyone recognized would be a decisive confrontation. Haven's Rest had the advantage of familiar terrain and prepared defensive positions, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Blackwood's forces had superior weapons and military organization, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory against opponents who had nothing left to lose. The battle began when Blackwood's men attempted to surround the settlement by moving through the forest in 3 separate columns. The defenders had anticipated this strategy and prepared accordingly. Hidden observers used predetermined signals to track the tribunal forces' movements, while carefully positioned obstacles channeled the attackers into killing zones where the community's limited firepower could be used most effectively. The first shots were fired when the northernmost column of tribunal members encountered a series of concealed pits filled with sharpened stakes. The screams of wounded men echoed through the forest, alerting the other columns that they were walking into a trap. What followed was a chaotic running battle that lasted throughout the day, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. The defenders' greatest asset was their knowledge of every trail, stream, and hiding place within miles of the settlement. They could move through the forest almost invisibly, striking at isolated groups of attackers before melting back into the wilderness. The tribunal forces, despite their superior numbers, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see against terrain that seemed actively hostile to their presence. By nightfall, Blackwood's forces had suffered heavy casualties without achieving any of their objectives. The settlement remained unconquered, their ammunition was running low, and the psychological impact of facing organized resistance had shaken the confidence of men who were accustomed to terrorizing helpless victims. Several tribunal members had already deserted, disappearing into the forest rather than continuing a fight that seemed increasingly hopeless. The second day of the siege brought a fundamental shift in tactics as both sides adapted to the realities of their situation. Blackwood, recognizing that direct assault was impossible, attempted to starve the settlement into submission by cutting off their access to water and outside supplies. The defenders responded by launching targeted raids against the tribunal camps, using their superior mobility to disrupt enemy operations and capture desperately needed ammunition. These raids revealed the extent to which the persecution had militarized mountain society. The defenders fought with a savagery that shocked even seasoned tribunal members, using techniques that blended traditional hunting skills with improvised combat methods. They moved through the forest like ghosts, striking without warning and disappearing before organized retaliation was possible. The psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their immediate tactical value. For the first time since the trials began, tribunal members found themselves on the receiving end of the violence they had inflicted on others. They experienced the terror of not knowing when or where the next attack would come, the frustration of fighting an enemy who refused to engage on conventional terms, and the growing realization that their victims were capable of fighting back. The third day brought the intervention that would ultimately determine the outcome of the siege. A force of nearly 200 armed men emerged from the southern forest, flying banners that identified them as militia from 3 different settlements. These were not trained soldiers, but farmers, craftsmen, and hunters who had finally recognized that the tribunals posed an existential threat to every mountain community. The arrival of these reinforcements transformed the dynamics of the confrontation. Blackwood's forces suddenly found themselves outnumbered and surrounded, fighting against an enemy that had grown from a single isolated community to a regional coalition. The psychological impact was devastating. The tribunal members had built their power on the assumption that mountain communities were too isolated and suspicious to cooperate against common threats. The final battle of the siege took place in the clearing where Blackwood had originally planned to conduct his mass trial. The irony was not lost on either side, as tribunal members found themselves forced to defend positions they had intended to use for executing their prisoners. The fighting was brutal and personal, with both sides understanding that defeat would mean not just death, but the complete destruction of their way of life. The turning point came when Blackwood himself was wounded by a defender who had lost his entire family to previous trials. As the tribunal leader fell, his forces began to break and scatter, abandoning their positions in a desperate attempt to escape the retribution they had spent years inflicting on others. The pursuit continued for hours, with defenders tracking fleeing tribunal members through miles of forest terrain. The aftermath of the siege marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power within the Appalachian region. The defeat of Blackwood's forces demonstrated that the tribunals could be resisted successfully, inspiring other communities to organize their own defensive measures. More importantly, It revealed the extent to which the persecution had been dependent on psychological terror rather than actual military superiority. The victory at Haven's Rest also exposed the true nature of the tribunal system. Among the captured documents was a copy of Blackwood's correspondence with Mordecai, revealing the extent to which the trials had been coordinated and planned rather than spontaneous outbreaks of religious fervor. The letters detailed strategies for identifying targets, techniques for manufacturing evidence, and methods for disposing of victims in ways that would leave no trace. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that the tribunals had been systematically targeting individuals and families who possessed knowledge, skills, or resources that could threaten their control over mountain society. The persecution wasn't about eliminating supernatural threats. It was about destroying the traditional leadership structures that had allowed mountain communities to remain independent and self-sufficient. The intelligence gathered from captured tribunal members revealed the full scope of Mordecai's network. Operating cells existed in at least 15 different valleys, with plans for expansion into territories that had previously been considered too remote or dangerous to penetrate. The Mountain Codex had been distributed to over 40 trusted lieutenants, each of whom was responsible for training local collaborators and establishing new tribunals. The resistance movement that emerged from the siege of Haven's Rest was fundamentally different from previous attempts to oppose the trials. Rather than isolated communities fighting for their own survival, this was a coordinated network of settlements committed to mutual defense and shared intelligence. They developed sophisticated communication systems, standardized defensive tactics, and most importantly, a unified command structure that could coordinate operations across vast distances. The man chosen to lead this resistance was a former militia captain named Jonathan Hartwell, a distant relative of the trading family that had been destroyed in Blackwood's earlier trials. Hartwell brought military experience and strategic thinking to a movement that had previously relied on desperation and local knowledge. Under his leadership, the resistance began to take the offensive against remaining tribunal cells. The intelligence network developed by the resistance was particularly effective at identifying and neutralizing tribunal operations before they could gain momentum. Former victims who had escaped the trials provided detailed information about tribunal methods, while sympathetic individuals within affected communities served as early warning systems for planned raids and arrests. The psychological warfare employed by the resistance was equally sophisticated. They understood that the tribunal's power had always been based on fear and isolation, so they focused on demonstrating that organized resistance was possible and that victims didn't have to face their persecutors alone. Stories of successful defenses spread through the mountain communities, inspiring others to organize their own protective measures. The counter-trials that began in late 1693 represented a complete reversal of the persecution's original dynamics. Captured tribunal members found themselves subjected to the same interrogation techniques they had used on their victims, forced to account for their actions under the same impossible standards of evidence they had applied to others. The irony was deliberate and devastating. The hunters had become the hunted. These proceedings revealed the extent to which ordinary mountain residents had been coerced into participating in the trials. Many tribunal members had joined not out of religious conviction, but from fear that refusal would make them targets for accusation. Others had been motivated by opportunities to settle personal grievances or acquire property from condemned families. The systematic nature of the corruption was both shocking and illuminating. The confessions extracted from captured tribunal members provided detailed information about the network's structure, financing, and future plans. They revealed that Mordecai had been receiving support from wealthy merchants and landowners who saw the trials as a way to acquire valuable mountain properties at minimal cost. The persecution had been as much about land speculation as religious extremism. The resistance's success in disrupting tribunal operations had immediate practical consequences for mountain communities. Families who had been living in constant fear of accusation could finally resume normal activities. Traditional healing practices, agricultural techniques, and craft skills that had been suppressed could be openly practiced again. The cultural recovery that followed was as important as the military victory. However, the defeat of Blackwood's forces and the disruption of several tribunal cells did not end the persecution entirely. Mordecai himself remained at large, along with several of his most trusted lieutenants. The Mountain Codex continued to circulate among sympathetic communities, and isolated incidents of witch hunting persisted in areas where the resistance had not yet established effective control. The winter of 1693 brought a temporary lull in the conflict as both sides regrouped and prepared for what everyone recognized would be a decisive confrontation. The resistance used this time to consolidate their gains, expand their network, and prepare for the inevitable counterattack that Mordecai was surely planning. The next phase of the conflict would determine whether the Appalachian witch trials would finally end or whether the persecution would evolve into an even more dangerous form. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of individual families, but the future of mountain society itself. The resistance had proven that the tribunals could be defeated, but the war for the soul of Appalachia was far from over. The winter months that followed the siege of Haven's Rest brought an eerie silence to the Appalachian valleys, broken only by the occasional report of isolated tribunal activity in the most remote hollows. But this quiet was deceptive. Beneath the surface, both sides were preparing for a confrontation that would determine the ultimate fate of the mountain communities. Mordecai had not been idle during his forced retreat, and the resistance movement was about to discover that their enemy possessed resources and allies they had never imagined. The first indication that something had changed came in February 1694, when a series of coordinated attacks struck resistance strongholds across 3 different states. These weren't the desperate raids of scattered tribunal remnants. They were precisely planned military operations that demonstrated intimate knowledge of resistance positions, communication networks, and defensive capabilities. Someone had been feeding detailed intelligence to Mordecai's forces, and the implications were terrifying. The attack on Miller's Gap exemplified the new level of sophistication in tribunal operations. The settlement had been one of the first to organize effective defenses after Haven's Rest, and their success had made them a symbol of resistance throughout the region. Their defensive positions had been carefully surveyed and mapped, their guard rotations had been observed and timed, and their supply lines had been identified and targeted for simultaneous disruption. The assault began at dawn with a coordinated artillery bombardment that caught the defenders completely off guard. The tribunal forces had acquired military-grade weapons that were far superior to anything the resistance possessed: cannons, professionally manufactured firearms, and ammunition that suggested substantial financial backing from sources outside the mountain region. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Sarah Mackenzie, one of the few survivors of the Miller's Gap attack, later described the horror of watching her community's defenses crumble under the unexpected firepower. Families who had felt secure behind their carefully constructed barriers found themselves trapped in burning buildings as cannon fire systematically destroyed everything they had built. The resistance fighters who had proven so effective against previous tribunal forces were overwhelmed by enemies who fought with professional military discipline. The intelligence network that had served the resistance so well was turned against them with ruthless efficiency. Safe houses were raided simultaneously across multiple valleys. Communication routes were severed by forces that seemed to know exactly where and when to strike, and key leaders were targeted for elimination with surgical precision. The resistance found itself fighting not just tribunal members, but what appeared to be a professional military force with unlimited resources. The most shocking discovery came when resistance fighters captured a tribunal supply convoy and found evidence of the network's true scope. Documents recovered from the wagons revealed that Mordecai had formed an alliance with colonial authorities who saw the witch trials as a convenient way to assert control over the notoriously independent mountain communities. The persecution had evolved from religious extremism into a systematic campaign of territorial conquest. The financial records were particularly revealing. Wealthy merchants from Charleston, Richmond, and Philadelphia had been financing tribunal operations in exchange for exclusive rights to acquire property seized from condemned families. The trials weren't just about eliminating supernatural threats. They were about clearing valuable mountain land for development by outside investors who had no connection to the communities they were destroying. The political dimension of the persecution was equally disturbing. Colonial governors had been quietly supporting tribunal activities because they offered a solution to the problem of ungovernable mountain populations who refused to acknowledge external authority. The trials provided a legal framework for eliminating community leaders, disrupting traditional social structures, and replacing them with compliant administrators who would serve colonial interests. This revelation transformed the resistance's understanding of what they were fighting. The tribunals weren't an aberration that could be defeated by local action. They were part of a broader strategy to subjugate the entire Appalachian region. The mountain communities weren't just defending themselves against religious persecution. They were fighting for their very existence as independent societies. The resistance's response to this intelligence was swift and decisive. Jonathan Hartwell called for a general assembly of all communities that had been affected by the trials, proposing the formation of a unified mountain confederation that could coordinate resistance across the entire region. The meeting took place in March 1694 at a location that had been carefully chosen for its defensibility and symbolic significance. The gathering convened in the ruins of the original Blackwood settlement, where the first tribunal had been established years earlier. The choice of location was deliberate. The burned foundations and overgrown clearings served as a reminder of what happened to communities that submitted to tribunal authority. Representatives from over 30 settlements attended, many traveling for days through dangerous territory to participate in what they understood could be their last chance to organize effective resistance. The debates that took place during the assembly revealed the full complexity of the situation facing mountain communities. Some representatives argued for negotiation with colonial authorities, hoping to find a compromise that would end the persecution without destroying their way of life. Others advocated for complete withdrawal deeper into the mountains, abandoning their current settlements rather than fighting a war they might not be able to win. The most radical proposal came from a group of younger leaders who had lost everything to the trials. They called for active rebellion against colonial authority, arguing that the mountain communities had never truly been part of the colonial system and owed no allegiance to governments that had betrayed them. This faction proposed establishing an independent mountain republic that would defend itself against all external threats. The woman who ultimately shaped the Assembly's decision was Elizabeth Corwin, the former midwife who had become the moral voice of the resistance movement. Her speech to the gathered representatives was recorded by multiple witnesses and later became legendary among mountain families. She pointed out that the choice was not between war and peace, but between dying on their feet or living on their knees. Corwin's argument was both practical and philosophical. She demonstrated that the tribunals had already destroyed the possibility of peaceful coexistence by systematically eliminating anyone who possessed the knowledge and skills necessary for mountain survival. The trials weren't targeting criminal behavior. They were attacking the cultural foundation that had allowed these communities to thrive in isolation. The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The Assembly agreed to form the Mountain Confederation, a military and political alliance that would coordinate resistance activities across the entire Appalachian region. More importantly, they voted to take offensive action against tribunal operations, recognizing that defensive measures alone could not defeat an enemy with superior resources and external support. The transformation of the resistance from a defensive network into an offensive military force required fundamental changes in organization, strategy, and tactics. The Confederation's first priority was establishing a reliable intelligence network that could identify tribunal positions, track their movements, and predict their operations. This meant recruiting sympathetic individuals within affected communities and establishing communication systems that could function despite tribunal efforts to disrupt them. The military reorganization was equally challenging. The Confederation needed to transform farmers, craftsmen, and hunters into effective soldiers capable of fighting professional military forces. This required not just weapons training, but the development of new tactical approaches that could exploit the advantages of familiar terrain while compensating for disadvantages in equipment and numbers. The psychological warfare component of the Confederation's strategy was particularly sophisticated. They understood that the tribunal's power had always been based on fear and isolation, so they focused on demonstrating that organized resistance was not only possible, but successful. Stories of Confederation victories spread through the mountain communities, inspiring others to join the resistance and undermining the tribunal's psychological dominance. The Confederation's first major offensive operation targeted the tribunal stronghold at Perdition Hollow, where Mordecai had established his primary base of operations. The attack was planned with military precision, using intelligence gathered over months of careful observation. The objective was not just to destroy the facility, but to capture Mordecai himself and the master copies of the Mountain Codex that were stored there. The assault began with a coordinated attack on the supply lines that sustained the Perdition Hollow operation. Confederation forces simultaneously struck at 3 different supply convoys, capturing weapons, ammunition, and provisions that would have been delivered to the tribunal stronghold. This preliminary operation served both tactical and psychological purposes. It demonstrated the Confederation's ability to strike at will while depriving the enemy of resources they needed for sustained operations. The main assault on Perdition Hollow took place during a new moon, when darkness would provide maximum concealment for Confederation forces. The attackers approached from multiple directions, using their knowledge of local terrain to position themselves for a coordinated strike at dawn. The plan called for simultaneous attacks on the perimeter defenses, the main compound, and the escape routes that Mordecai might use to flee. The battle that followed was the largest and most significant engagement of the entire conflict. Over 400 Confederation fighters participated in the assault, facing tribunal forces that had been reinforced with professional soldiers and military equipment. The fighting was fierce and personal, with both sides understanding that the outcome would determine the future of the mountain region. The Confederation's advantage lay in their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their absolute commitment to the cause. They had spent years learning every trail, stream, and hiding place within miles of the target, and they used this knowledge to outmaneuver enemies who were fighting in unfamiliar territory. The psychological impact of fighting on home ground cannot be overstated. These were people defending their families, their communities, and their way of life. The tribunal forces, despite their superior equipment and training, found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. Confederation fighters appeared from concealed positions, struck with devastating effectiveness, and disappeared before organized retaliation was possible. The professional soldiers who had been brought in to support the tribunals discovered that conventional military tactics were ineffective against opponents who refused to fight conventional battles. The turning point came when Confederation forces succeeded in breaching the main compound's defenses and engaging the tribunal leadership directly. The fighting inside the compound was brutal and chaotic, with both sides understanding that quarter would neither be asked nor given. The Confederation fighters had seen too much suffering to show mercy to their tormentors, while the tribunal members knew that capture would mean facing the same fate they had inflicted on countless victims. Mordecai himself was found in the underground chamber where he had stored the master copies of the Mountain Codex, along with detailed records of every trial conducted under his authority. The documentation discovered in this chamber would provide evidence of the persecution's true scope and reveal the identities of collaborators who had participated in the trials. The psychological impact of capturing these records was as important as the military victory itself. The aftermath of the Perdition Hollow assault marked the beginning of the end for the tribunal system. With their primary base destroyed and their leadership captured or killed, the remaining tribunal cells found themselves isolated and vulnerable to Confederation attacks. The network that had once seemed invincible began to collapse as individual cells were systematically eliminated by forces that had learned to fight as effectively as their enemies. The trials that followed the capture of Mordecai and his associates represented a complete reversal of the persecution's original dynamics. The man who had orchestrated the deaths of hundreds of innocent people found himself subjected to the same interrogation techniques he had developed, forced to account for his actions under the same impossible standards of evidence he had applied to others. The confessions extracted from captured tribunal leaders revealed the full extent of the corruption that had driven the persecution. The trials had been as much about personal enrichment as religious extremism, with tribunal members systematically targeting families whose property they coveted or whose independence they resented. The spiritual justifications had been largely pretense, concealing motivations that were entirely secular and self-serving. The documentation recovered from Perdition Hollow also revealed the broader political context of the persecution. Colonial authorities had not just tolerated the trials, they had actively encouraged them as a way to assert control over mountain communities that had previously been effectively independent. The persecution had been part of a systematic campaign to transform the Appalachian region from a collection of autonomous settlements into a territory that could be governed and exploited by external authorities. The Mountain Confederation's victory at Perdition Hollow inspired similar resistance movements in other regions where tribunal activities had been reported. Communities that had been terrorized into submission suddenly found the courage to organize their own defenses and take offensive action against their persecutors. The psychological impact of the Confederation's success rippled through the colonial frontier, demonstrating that organized resistance could defeat even the most systematic oppression. The final phase of the conflict involved hunting down the remaining tribunal cells and eliminating the infrastructure that had sustained the persecution. This was dangerous and difficult work, requiring Confederation forces to operate in territory that was often hostile and always unfamiliar. The remaining tribunal members were desperate and well armed, making them dangerous opponents even in their weakened state. The campaign to eliminate the remaining tribunals also involved addressing the broader political and economic forces that had made the persecution possible. The Mountain Confederation began negotiating directly with colonial authorities, making it clear that future attempts to subjugate mountain communities would be met with organized military resistance. These negotiations established the foundation for the political autonomy that mountain communities would maintain for generations to come. The cultural recovery that followed the end of the trials was as important as the military victory itself. Families who had been living in constant fear could finally resume normal activities. Traditional practices that had been suppressed could be openly practiced again, and the knowledge systems that had sustained mountain communities for generations could be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The scars left by the persecution would take generations to heal, but the Mountain Confederation had proven that systematic oppression could be defeated through organized resistance and mutual support. The victory established precedents that would influence mountain culture for centuries to come, creating a tradition of independence and self-reliance that would define Appalachian identity long after the specific events of the witch trials had faded from memory. The final confrontation between the Mountain Confederation and the forces that had orchestrated the persecution would determine not just the immediate fate of the mountain communities, but the long-term trajectory of Appalachian society. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome would echo through the region's history for generations to come. The systematic elimination of remaining tribunal cells required a different approach than the large-scale military operations that had characterized the Confederation's earlier victories. These were not concentrated forces that could be defeated in decisive battles, but scattered remnants operating in remote locations where traditional military tactics were ineffective. The Confederation had to develop new strategies that combined intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and surgical strikes against targets that often consisted of no more than a handful of desperate men. The hunt for these remaining cells was led by a specialized unit within the Confederation known as the Shadow Walkers, men and women who had lost everything to the trials and possessed both the skills and motivation necessary for this type of dangerous work. These individuals had been selected not just for their tracking abilities and knowledge of mountain terrain, but for their understanding of tribunal psychology and methods. They knew how their enemies thought, how they operated, and most importantly, how they could be found. The Shadow Walkers' first major success came in the spring of 1695, when they located a tribunal cell operating in the remote valley known as Weeping Hollow. This group had been responsible for the disappearance of several families from neighboring settlements, but their isolated location and careful operational security had made them difficult to locate. The cell was led by a former associate of Blackwood named Matthias Crane, who had managed to maintain a small but effective operation despite the collapse of the broader tribunal network. The intelligence that led to Crane's discovery came from an unexpected source, a young woman named Martha Sinclair, who had escaped from the tribunal's custody during a botched execution ceremony. Her account of the cell's location, membership, and activities provided the Shadow Walkers with the information they needed to plan a successful operation. More importantly, her testimony revealed that this particular cell had been conducting experiments that went beyond even the brutal standards established by previous tribunals. Crane's group had been attempting to develop what they called enhanced purification techniques, methods of execution that were designed to prevent the accused from maintaining any connection to the supernatural forces they allegedly served. These techniques involved prolonged torture sessions that were justified as necessary to completely sever demonic bonds before death. The psychological impact on both victims and witnesses was devastating, creating a level of terror that exceeded even the original trials. The Shadow Walkers' assault on the Weeping Hollow cell was planned with meticulous attention to detail. They had spent weeks observing the tribunal's routines, mapping their defensive positions, and identifying the optimal timing for an attack. The operation began before dawn on a foggy morning that provided perfect concealment for the approaching Confederation forces. The attack itself was swift and merciless. The Shadow Walkers had learned from their enemies' methods and applied them with ruthless efficiency. Crane and his associates found themselves subjected to the same sudden violence they had inflicted on others, with no opportunity for defense or escape. The psychological tables had been completely turned. The hunters had become the hunted in the most literal sense. The documents recovered from the Weeping Hollow operation revealed disturbing evidence of continued external support for tribunal activities. Despite the Confederation's military victories and the apparent collapse of the persecution, certain colonial authorities and wealthy merchants were still providing financial backing for isolated tribunal cells. The persecution had gone underground, but it had not ended entirely. This discovery forced the Mountain Confederation to expand their operations beyond the immediate mountain region. The network of support for the tribunals extended into major colonial cities, where wealthy investors continued to profit from seized mountain properties. These urban supporters had never been directly involved in the trials, but their financial backing had made the persecution possible, and their continued involvement threatened to sustain it indefinitely. The Confederation's response to this challenge required diplomatic as well as military solutions. They began establishing contacts with sympathetic individuals in colonial cities, building a network of supporters who could provide intelligence about tribunal financing and political backing. This urban network was crucial for understanding the broader context of the persecution and developing strategies to address its root causes. The most significant breakthrough in this effort came from an unexpected source. Marcus Thorne, the former tribunal lieutenant who had documented the siege of Haven's Rest. Thorne had been captured during the Perdition Hollow assault and had spent months in Confederation custody, where he had gradually been convinced to cooperate with his captors. His detailed knowledge of tribunal operations and financing proved invaluable for planning operations against remaining cells. Thorne's most important contribution was his identification of the key financial networks that had sustained the persecution. He provided names, locations, and methods of operation for the merchants and investors who had profited from the trials. This information allowed the Confederation to develop a comprehensive strategy for eliminating the economic incentives that had driven much of the persecution. The campaign against tribunal financing required a completely different set of skills than mountain warfare. The Confederation had to learn to operate in urban environments where their traditional advantages were meaningless and their enemies possessed significant political and legal protections. This meant developing new approaches to intelligence gathering, infiltration, and sabotage that could be effective in colonial cities. The Confederation's urban operations were led by individuals who had the education and social connections necessary to move effectively in colonial society. Many of these operatives were former victims of the trials who had managed to escape and rebuild their lives in cities where their past was unknown. Their motivation was intensely personal. They had lost families, communities, and entire ways of life to the persecution, and they were determined to ensure that it could never happen again. The first major urban operation targeted the Charleston Merchant House of Pemberton and Associates, which had been one of the largest financiers of tribunal activities. The company had systematically purchased property seized from condemned families at far below market value, then resold it to plantation owners and land speculators at enormous profits. The operation had been so successful that Pemberton was planning to expand his investments into other regions where similar opportunities might arise. The Confederation's approach to dealing with Pemberton was both sophisticated and ruthless. Rather than direct confrontation, they launched a campaign of economic warfare designed to destroy his business and reputation simultaneously. Forged documents were introduced that suggested Pemberton had been skimming profits from his investors, while carefully orchestrated rumors spread stories about his involvement in activities that would be scandalous even by colonial standards. The psychological impact of these operations extended far beyond their immediate targets. Other merchants and investors who had profited from the trials suddenly found themselves wondering if they too were being investigated, if their business dealings were being scrutinized, and if they might face consequences for their involvement in the persecution. The climate of fear that had once terrorized mountain communities was now being turned against those who had created it. The legal dimension of the Confederation's campaign was equally important. They began documenting the illegal seizure of property, the lack of due process in tribunal proceedings, and the corruption of colonial officials who had supported the persecution. This documentation was used to file formal complaints with higher authorities, creating legal challenges that forced supporters of the trials to defend their actions in public forums. The political consequences of these legal challenges were significant. Colonial officials who had quietly supported the tribunals found themselves facing public scrutiny and formal investigations. The persecution that had been conducted in secret was suddenly being exposed to public examination, and the revelations were shocking even to people who had been aware that something unusual was happening in the mountain regions. The media campaign that accompanied these legal challenges was carefully orchestrated to maximize public impact. Stories about the trials were published in colonial newspapers, often accompanied by testimonies from survivors that provided graphic details about the persecution. The public reaction was immediate and intense. People who had never been to the mountains were horrified by accounts of the systematic torture and murder that had been conducted in their name. The religious establishment's response to these revelations was particularly significant. Many colonial ministers had initially supported the tribunals as a legitimate response to supernatural threats, but the evidence of corruption and abuse forced them to reconsider their position. Several prominent religious leaders publicly denounced the trials and called for full investigations into the activities of Mordecai and his associates. The political momentum generated by these various campaigns culminated in a series of formal hearings conducted by colonial assemblies in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. These hearings provided a public forum for survivors to testify about their experiences and for the Confederation to present evidence of the persecution's true scope and nature. The testimony was devastating, and the political impact was immediate. The hearings revealed not just the brutality of the trials, but the systematic corruption that had made them possible. Colonial officials had accepted bribes to ignore illegal activities, judges had been influenced to rule in favor of tribunal interests, and law enforcement had been compromised to the point where it actively participated in the persecution. The entire system of colonial justice had been corrupted by the influence of those who profited from the trials. The legislative response to these revelations was swift and comprehensive. New laws were passed that specifically prohibited the types of activities that had characterized the tribunal system, while existing laws were strengthened to prevent future abuses. More importantly, compensation funds were established to provide support for survivors and the families of victims, acknowledging the colonial government's responsibility for the persecution. The cultural impact of these legislative changes extended far beyond their immediate legal consequences. The public acknowledgement of the trial's illegality and the government's complicity in them validated the experiences of survivors who had been traumatized by events that others had denied or minimized. The formal recognition of their suffering was an important step in the healing process for individuals and communities that had been devastated by the persecution. The mountain community's response to these political victories was complex and varied. Some welcomed the official recognition and compensation, seeing it as validation of their struggle and sacrifice. Others remained skeptical of any government involvement, having learned through bitter experience that external authorities could not be trusted to protect their interests. The debate over how to respond to these offers of reconciliation revealed deep divisions within the Confederation about the future of mountain society. The practical challenges of implementing these new policies were enormous. Many of the communities that had been destroyed by the trials no longer existed, making it difficult to identify legitimate survivors or determine appropriate compensation. The documentation that might have supported individual claims had been systematically destroyed by tribunal members who had understood the importance of eliminating evidence of their activities. The Confederation's response to these challenges was to establish their own system for verifying survivor claims and distributing compensation. This system was based on community testimony and collective memory rather than official documentation, reflecting the mountain community's traditional approaches to justice and resource distribution. The process was slow and sometimes contentious, but it was conducted according to principles that the mountain communities understood and trusted. The long-term consequences of the Appalachian witch trials extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The persecution had fundamentally altered the relationship between mountain communities and external authorities, creating a legacy of suspicion and independence that would influence Appalachian culture for generations. The trials had also demonstrated the importance of collective action and mutual support in resisting systematic oppression. The preservation of memory about the trials became a crucial concern for the Confederation leadership. They understood that the persecution had been possible partly because previous generations had not maintained adequate records of similar abuses. The systematic documentation of the trials and their aftermath was seen as essential for preventing future occurrences of such systematic persecution. The educational initiatives that emerged from this concern were comprehensive and far-reaching. The Confederation established schools in mountain communities that had previously lacked formal educational institutions, ensuring that future generations would have the literacy and knowledge necessary to recognize and resist systematic oppression. These schools taught not just basic academic subjects, but also the history of the trials and the principles of collective resistance that had made victory possible. The cultural revival that accompanied these educational efforts was equally important. Traditional practices that had been suppressed during the persecution were openly celebrated and taught to younger generations. The knowledge systems that had sustained mountain communities for generations were preserved and transmitted, ensuring that the cultural foundation of mountain society would survive despite the trauma of the trials. The economic reconstruction of the mountain region required massive coordination and mutual support. Many communities had been entirely destroyed during the persecution, while others had been severely damaged by the loss of key individuals and resources. The Confederation's response was to establish a system of mutual aid that pooled resources from surviving communities and distributed them according to need rather than market principles. The success of this economic reconstruction demonstrated the viability of the cooperative principles that had always characterized mountain society. Communities that had been written off as permanently damaged managed to rebuild and thrive through collective effort and shared resources. The economic models developed during this period would influence mountain communities for generations, providing alternatives to the market-based systems that had contributed to the persecution. The military legacy of the Confederation was equally significant. The mountain communities had proven that organized resistance could defeat systematic oppression even when the oppressors possessed superior resources and external support. The tactical innovations developed during the conflict were preserved and transmitted to future generations, ensuring that mountain communities would never again be defenseless against external threats. The political autonomy that the Confederation had won through military victory was formalized through a series of agreements with colonial authorities. These agreements recognized the mountain community's right to self-governance and established principles for interaction with external authorities that protected their independence while maintaining necessary connections to the broader colonial system. The psychological healing required by the persecution survivors was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the reconstruction process. Many individuals had witnessed or experienced horrors that left lasting trauma, while entire communities had been devastated by the loss of family members and neighbors. The Confederation's response was to establish support systems that drew on traditional mountain approaches to healing while incorporating new understanding of trauma and recovery. The spiritual dimension of this healing process was particularly important. The trials had been conducted in the name of religious purification, creating complex relationships between survivors and their faith traditions. The Confederation worked with sympathetic religious leaders to develop new approaches to spirituality that acknowledged the trauma of the persecution while preserving the positive aspects of mountain religious traditions. The regional impact of the Confederation's victory extended beyond the immediate mountain areas to influence political and social developments throughout the colonial frontier. Other communities that had faced similar threats from external authorities drew inspiration from the mountain community's successful resistance, leading to broader movements for frontier independence and self-governance. The precedents established by the Mountain Confederation's victory would influence American political development for generations. The principle that communities had the right to resist systematic oppression through organized collective action became part of the broader American tradition of democratic resistance to tyranny. The specific tactics and strategies developed during the conflict would be studied and adapted by future generations facing similar challenges. The documentation of the trials and their aftermath created a historical record that would be preserved and studied by scholars for centuries. The systematic collection of testimonies, documents, and evidence provided future generations with detailed knowledge about how systematic persecution develops and how it can be resisted. This historical record became an important resource for understanding the dynamics of oppression and resistance in American history. The story of the Appalachian witch trials and the Mountain Confederation's victory over them represents one of the most significant but least known episodes in American history. The persecution demonstrated the dangers of systematic oppression and the corruption that can result when power is concentrated in the hands of individuals who are not accountable to the communities they claim to serve. The resistance showed that organized collective action can defeat even the most systematic oppression when communities are willing to support each other and fight for their fundamental rights. The legacy of these events continues to influence Appalachian culture and American political traditions to this day. The principles of independence, self-reliance, and collective resistance that were forged in the crucible of the persecution remain central to mountain identity and continue to shape how these communities respond to external challenges. The victory of the Mountain Confederation proved that systematic oppression can be defeated and that communities have both the right and the responsibility to defend themselves against those who would destroy their way of life. The broader implications of the Mountain Confederation's victory became clear in the years that followed, as colonial authorities struggled to comprehend how a collection of isolated mountain communities had managed to defeat a systematic campaign of persecution that had enjoyed official support and substantial financial backing. The success of the resistance fundamentally challenged assumptions about frontier governance and the relationship between central authority and local autonomy that had shaped colonial policy for generations. The intelligence networks that had been developed during the conflict proved to be remarkably durable and adaptable. Rather than dissolving after the immediate threat had passed, these communication systems evolved into permanent institutions that connected mountain communities across vast distances. The Confederation had created something unprecedented in American frontier history, a decentralized but coordinated network of autonomous communities that could act collectively when threatened while maintaining their independence during normal times. The psychological transformation that had occurred within mountain society was equally profound. Communities that had once been isolated and suspicious of their neighbors had learned to trust each other and work together for common goals. The shared experience of persecution and resistance had created bonds that transcended the traditional boundaries of kinship and local loyalty that had previously defined mountain social organization. The economic innovations that emerged from the Reconstruction process challenged fundamental assumptions about frontier development and resource allocation. The Confederation's success with cooperative economic models demonstrated that communities could thrive without submitting to external control or accepting the exploitation that characterized most colonial economic relationships. These alternative approaches to economic organization would influence mountain communities for generations. The cultural renaissance that followed the end of the trials was particularly significant because it represented a conscious effort to preserve and strengthen traditional knowledge systems that had been targeted for destruction. The persecution had revealed the vulnerability of oral traditions and informal educational practices, leading to systematic efforts to document and institutionalize cultural knowledge that had previously been transmitted through informal channels. The legal precedents established by the Confederation's victory had implications that extended far beyond the immediate mountain region. The principle that communities had the right to resist systematic oppression through organized collective action became part of the broader American tradition of democratic resistance to tyranny. The specific legal arguments developed during the conflict would be cited by future generations facing similar challenges from authoritarian governments. The military innovations that had emerged from the conflict were studied and adapted by other frontier communities facing threats from external authorities. The Confederation's success in developing tactics that could defeat professionally trained forces despite inferior equipment and numbers provided a model for asymmetric warfare that would influence American military thinking for centuries. The documentation efforts that had begun during the trials themselves evolved into comprehensive historical preservation projects that created unprecedented records of frontier life and community organization. These archives would become invaluable resources for understanding how American frontier communities developed and maintained their independence in the face of external pressures. The educational institutions that were established in the aftermath of the trials represented a fundamental shift in how mountain communities approached the transmission of knowledge and cultural values. The Confederation's leaders understood that formal education was essential for preventing future persecution and ensuring that the lessons learned from the conflict would be preserved for future generations. The spiritual healing that was required after the persecution involved complex negotiations between traditional mountain religious practices and the trauma created by the trials' pseudo-religious justifications. Communities had to develop new approaches to spirituality that acknowledged the sacred while rejecting the corruption that had been used to justify systematic murder. The regional political arrangements that emerged from the Confederation's victory established principles of local autonomy and self-governance that would influence American political development for generations. The agreements negotiated with colonial authorities created frameworks for interaction between central government and local communities that protected local independence while maintaining necessary connections to broader political and economic systems. The investigation of the financial networks that had supported the persecution revealed the extent to which systematic oppression could be driven by economic incentives rather than ideological motivations. The Confederation's success in disrupting these networks demonstrated that effective resistance required understanding and addressing the underlying economic structures that made persecution profitable. The compensation systems that were established for survivors and their families created new models for addressing historical injustices that went beyond simple monetary payments. The Confederation's approach to reparations emphasized community healing and collective recovery rather than individual compensation, reflecting mountain values of mutual support and shared responsibility. The counterintelligence operations that had been developed during the conflict evolved into permanent security measures that protected mountain communities from future infiltration and subversion. These systems were based on community knowledge and collective vigilance rather than formal law enforcement, reflecting the mountain community's traditional approaches to maintaining security and order. The diplomatic relationships that were established with sympathetic individuals and organizations in colonial cities created lasting networks of support that extended the Confederation's influence far beyond the immediate mountain region. These urban allies provided crucial intelligence, political support, and economic assistance that helped ensure the long-term success of the resistance movement. The technological innovations that emerged from the conflict included improvements in communication systems, defensive construction, and weapons manufacturing that gave mountain communities significant advantages in any future confrontations with external authorities. These innovations were carefully guarded and transmitted only to trusted allies within the Confederation network. The psychological warfare techniques that had been developed during the conflict were preserved and refined for potential future use. The Confederation's success in turning the tribunal's own methods against them demonstrated the importance of understanding enemy psychology and exploiting their vulnerabilities through targeted psychological operations. The historical narrative that emerged from the trials and their aftermath became a foundational story for mountain identity and culture. The persecution and resistance were remembered not just as historical events, but as defining experiences that shaped the character and values of entire communities. This narrative provided a framework for understanding the relationship between mountain communities and external authorities that would influence political attitudes for generations. The legacy of the Appalachian witch trials extends far beyond the immediate victims and their communities. The persecution demonstrated the dangers of systematic oppression and the corruption that can result when power is concentrated in the hands of individuals who are not accountable to the communities they claim to serve. The resistance showed that organized collective action can defeat even the most systematic oppression when communities are willing to support each other and fight for their fundamental rights. The story of these trials and the Mountain Confederation's victory over them represents one of the most significant but least known episodes in American history. The events that unfolded in those remote valleys between 1692 and 1736 established principles and precedents that would influence American political development, military strategy, and cultural identity for centuries to come. The documentation that has survived from this period provides unprecedented insight into how systematic persecution develops and how it can be resisted. The testimonies of survivors, the records of resistance operations, and the evidence of tribunal corruption create a comprehensive picture of oppression and resistance remains relevant to understanding similar conflicts throughout history. The mountain communities that emerged from this crucible were fundamentally transformed by their experience. They had learned that isolation was vulnerability, that traditional authorities could not be trusted, and that survival required collective action and mutual support. These lessons shaped their approach to governance, economics, and social organization in ways that distinguished them from other American communities for generations. The Appalachian witch trials stand as a testament to both the darkest impulses of human nature and the extraordinary courage that ordinary people can display when fighting for their survival and freedom. The persecution revealed how quickly civilized society can descend into systematic brutality when fear and greed are allowed to override basic human decency. The resistance demonstrated that communities possess the power to defend themselves against oppression when they are willing to stand together and fight for their fundamental rights. The lessons learned from these events remain relevant today, as communities around the world continue to face threats from authoritarian governments, systematic persecution, and the corruption of institutions that are supposed to protect rather than oppress. The Mountain Confederation's victory proves that resistance is possible, that oppression can be defeated, and that communities have both the right and the responsibility to defend themselves against those who would destroy their way of life. The story of the Appalachian witch trials deserves to be remembered not just as a historical curiosity, but as a crucial chapter in the ongoing struggle for human freedom and dignity. The courage of those who resisted, the sacrifice of those who died, and the determination of those who survived created a legacy that continues to inspire all who face the challenge of standing up to systematic oppression and fighting for the principles of justice and human dignity that define civilized society.